I guess like the whole purpose of this call is that we're going to talk about, just like the previous video that we did, we're going to talk about the LIMAR model. And as it, as it pertains to, we've talked about deadlift, so we're going to talk about it as it pertains to the squat. So do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
Yeah, I can start. So we'll talk a bit about, how do we use the expansion and compression, and how do we use assessments to determine where a lifter may be struggling with management of center of gravity. Because I think the way we use the model, JJ, I think we're trying to identify where a lifter may be struggling in certain areas of the squat. So we have the whole arc from 0 degrees of hip flexion to, most people only have 120 degrees, which they should only have 120 degrees hip flexion. So, but in the powerlifting squat, we only need like a 95, 100, right? But the question is, if a lifter isn't able to hit the required depth, where would we need to kind of seek a bit more expansion or a bit more compression within their bodies, right? So into their system. So I think, at the top of the squat, we know we have a little trusty friend here, but we have a bit of a if they can't hit 60 degrees of depth in the squat, we know that they're going to be in a late stance representation, right? So their center of gravity.
So I think one thing to clarify with people is the top half of a squat is late. So if you look at the arc, maybe I'll edit a photo in. The bottom bit is zone 1, the middle bit is 2, and the top is 3. So it's early, middle, late. Instead of what people would think, because it starts at the top is early, but it's because you have to propel out, right? So your early would be at the bottom. Yeah. So just a
exactly. And we basically have to absorb weight, otherwise we'll fall to the ground, which is why we need to short.
People flip the thing. I know I flipped the thing myself before. So yeah.
So yeah, exactly. At the top, it's a late stance, because otherwise, if the bottom was late stance, that wouldn't make much sense, because people who can't absorb weight or who can't hit acid grass, how can they be in heel strike, right? So I think it's an easy way of thinking about it. So at the top, it's a toe off presentation. If you're able to get to around 60 to 90, 100, 110 degrees, that's more of a mid stance representation. And if you can hit like a acid grass squat, that would be a heel strike representation. But I think for us as powerlifting coaches, I think our main concern is, how do we just get lifters to that mid stance representation? Because let's be honest, if you're powerlifting and you're relatively okay at it, you're very unlikely to have very good measurements to go to a heel strike representation, nor do you actually need those type of measurements. I think that's a very important concept for people to understand, is when we use this model, we're not trying to get you to have the most amount of movement variability, the movement options, so that you can hit acid grasses. We're trying to get you to lift the most amount of weight and make you relatively compressed individuals, but just have just about enough expansion to go about doing other things in life, right? And to make sure you're still moving well, right? I think that's a super important consideration.
Yeah. So I think I mean, similarly to the deadlift video, I think where we started was the foot. So I think in terms of thinking about the squat, because you've been talking a lot about heel strike, I think that would be a good place to start for the squat as well, right? So I think again, we go back to the model. You have your heel strike, which is your zone 1, which is again, if this is the foot, right?
Slowly foot model. There we go.
Perfect. Okay, so do a heel strike where the tibia is behind the foot. So again, heel strike to so essentially zone 1 to zone 2 is heel till the zone 1 is heel till the big toe comes down. Right, and then zone 2 is when the ankle rock. So you have your heel rocker, your ankle.
So you go from here to here.
Yeah. So that is so that's your zone 2, and then your zone 3 is
well, it's more just the foot moving.
Yeah. So until your heel comes up all the way, and then it finishes, right? So I think this is one of the things that I actually I think I spoke to a client this morning about, is that because he knows the model, right? I think one of the things is that When we spoke about the deadlift, we were talking about a very compressed foot, a very zone 2 foot, a very exist where the tibia is kind of like existing in that point after the first mat drops, right, touches the ground, and it starts to kind of dorsiflex, right? So that would be our zone 2 for the deadlift. I think one of the things that why it doesn't kind of apply to the squat is simply because in a deadlift there really isn't much of a yielding component, right? So if you there's no force absorption, right? Essentially it's just you're going from a point where you are out of position, and then you just compress into position and then you explode up, right? So that would be for the deadlift. But for the squat, I think people think it's all midfoot. But I think one of the main misconceptions is that people don't really know where their midfoot is, and why, and they actually stay they stay late as a late representation throughout, or they start mid and they by the time they hit the bottom of the squat they are late, and then it's just late from there. There isn't and when you're late, you don't produce force. You express force, right? You think about baseball. You release the baseball, and the force is expressed in the speed of the ball, right? Or if you kick a soccer ball or anything, right? So there really isn't much force being expressed. And I think the way that I like to think about it is that you need to keep, when you descend into the hold, you need some level of yielding. You need to be midfoot or even earlier than that, right? So this is why some people think, this is why I think people put themselves in heels, for example. It's because you essentially bring the angle of the tibia behind the ankle, right? It's just that now it's like that instead of like that, right? So I think that's a very really important point to consider, right? People who don't have who who whose heels kind of come off the floor, if they're lucky they'll hit depth, but then when they come up, it's a very like slow kind of like grind out of the hole. But if they're unlucky, they don't even hit depth, right? Because there really isn't space up the chain for them to move into, in terms of just being able to absorb force, right? And then you see a lot of like kind of common compensations that happen kind of up the chain, and usually in a hyperextension or a flexion or the pelvis tucking under. All of these things are kind of sign that of a mismanagement of center of mass. I think that is kind of like the big point of the squat, right? Like, how can we kind of organize the center of mass over a base of support, which is essentially the width of the length of our feet.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think a lot of people, like you said, like when we coach a client, we're like, okay, we want to manage the center of mass so it never goes on to the toes, right? And we're like, okay, like you said, stay over the midfoot. But I think a lot of people, when they think of the midfoot, they're thinking more like this region. But in reality, it's more of, I would say it's like 65% here and 35% here, because exactly what you said, it's like if powerlifters who are pretty poor at managing a center of gravity in the first place and they're biased towards a late representation, they're gonna be pitching forward no matter what, right? Especially when the weight gets pretty heavy. So I think it's like you're right. It's like we have to be biasing, like you said, more of that 65% heel and that 35%, that forefoot, where it's like that fifth and first mat, right? I think that's a super useful way of looking at it. Yeah.
And I also think it's not necessarily that powerlifters are bad at managing center of mass. It's just that you have a weight literally pushing you forward.
Yeah.
So it's so you might get someone with a resting kind of presentation that is your typical kind of narrows, right? You have a resting presentation where it's all like, the back is pretty round, the rib cage is pretty, retracted in a sense. You see a lot of thoracic flexion, which you will kind of like usually associate with like ribs being back. It's not, but once you put that bar on your back, it's just going to push everything forward. So if you are afraid to push back against the bar, right, the bar will win, and what you think is midfoot actually isn't, right? Because you have about, I mean, if you're a good squatter, you probably have like 180 kilos of force, like not just pushing you down but also pushing you forward.
Yeah.
So I think from a practical standpoint, what this looks like is, again, like we said, looking at the the foot, right? If you squat and you look at the foot and you are seeing some within the phase of the squat, if you're seeing a different strategy that's happening at the foot compared to what you're expecting to happen, right? So if we're thinking about lowering, right, it needs to be a yielding, right? Because you need to move from zone 3 to zone 2, and then obviously you never hit zone 1, but you still need to yield through that zone, right? So when you yield through that zone, you need a foot that's yielding, right, which is a kind of more heel strike foot, right? And as you come down, and then once you hit that kind of 90-degree range, right, where you're meant to be in zone 2 of hip flexion, you should see a foot that is pronated, that is flat, that is, has some level, or a pronating foot rather than a pronated foot, right? And if that doesn't happen, like some people, they get taught to root really hard. If that doesn't happen, a lot of other structures pick up the rotations, the rotational needs. And I mean, you're someone that experiences that. Yeah, right. Like you get yours is just like yours is really messy, but
Everything.
I mean
just get everything in there.
The most common one is number one is knee pain, right? Obviously you can't really say that for sure, but from a biomechanical kind of lens that we're approaching it, your tibia is going to your tibia that's meant to be internally rotating as your knees flex is now going to be kept in external rotation.
The proximal tibia. The proximal, proximal tibia.
Yeah, the proximal, and then your knees can't bend, and then it goes up the chain, so your hips won't create any yielding. So the thing that's going to so how it looks like practically is going to look like a spine that's hyperextending.
Yeah.
Right. So now your lumbar spine, right, is picking up the ability to yield. So what it looks like is, for some people, when they can stack really nicely up top, but as soon as they hit depth, they arch the back, right? It's because everything down the chain can't create that kind of yielding force, so the spine yields instead. And because the weight is pushing from the back, it's going to dump everything into like this big anterior tilt. And then when the anterior tilt happens, because the pelvis so if you
dump forward like that,
so what it will do as well is it'll pull the knees in, so it will pull the femurs into internal rotation, right? And then you'll see that big valgus, and you're like, oh, knee valgus is back, drive your knees out some more. It's like, no, that's causing more of the problem, because you're just trying to keep a foot supinated when it's meant to be pronating. Right? So all of these rotations get picked up like up the chain, right? And then people are like, oh, you have a bracing problem. You have it's like, no, you just let go of the foot, right? Just let go of the foot, let go of the tension, let it do what it needs to do, and the rest of the chain will follow. So that's kind of like my piece on the foot, to be honest with you.
I think a good conclusion is, like, we just have to let things, like, we shouldn't be trying to cue any particular thing when it comes to the foot. We should just let it go through its full cycle, because like you said, simple way of coaching people is, like, if you're trying to cue a form of rooting, like you said, it's just going to lead to inefficiencies above when it comes to the back and also to the knee, right? So I think just to lead on to a bit of that, it's like, when we're talking about getting that internal rotation, we see a lot of people sometimes cue this knees out effect. And I think a simple reason why some people may do this is they're just trying to create a compensatory effect to try to hit depth. And we see this a lot when it comes to maybe bigger guys as well, or people who we think may lack the ability to stack well. I think a simple explanation is, if we just have this knees out effect, it creates this instantaneous torque where it allows you to enter and rotate back in,
Yeah.
right? Now, I think the question is, when people ask, oh, Lok See, should I do knees out? Well, you know, if it's a compensating strategy that can help you lift amount of weight, then theoretically, yes. But I think it's also a question of, is it sustainable for a longer period of time? I don't know. I mean, everybody has their own way of doing it, but I personally think it's best to, let it track naturally instead of just creating this knees out effect. Because going back to what you said about knee flexion, right? Knee flexion requires the distal femur to externally rotate and to allow the proximal tibia to internally rotate, right?
So
if you're just, yeah.
So I think one of the things that will help is, people think that the knee is kind of like this hinge joint, right? But actually, if you look at the anatomy of the knee, it's not, right? Like, look, this is how your knees kind of move on each other. You have a kind of like a medial and a lateral, like condyle, right? So they literally, when they bend, they rotate on each other, right? So if you've ever had like look, this is a screw home mechanism, right? If you ever had a surgery or anything that looks like anything that will kind of like, like I've had an ACL construction, and I've had a bit of my I think it's medial meniscus kind of like shaved off, so I don't have full knee flexion, right? So one of the things is, if you can't rotate, if your knees can't rotate, I think the official line is 11 degrees, right? So if they can't rotate on each other along this kind of along the condyles, right? Yeah, there we go. Right, they need to turn, right? Flexion, extension, they need to turn on each other, right? Then you have no chance of bending the knee, right? You literally don't. And because you've used a muscular strategy to almost lock up joint range, right? It's just pure muscular strength, pure muscular like force holding joints in position, right? And people pick up a lot of things like, knee pain. People pick up a lot of things like quad tendonitis, so on and so forth. It's because you never let that quad like go through a range that it needs to. And it's also the same people that like when you go into something like, say, a knee flexion exercise, like a leg extension or a hamstring curl, they never have knee pain in that exercise, right? Because their foot is not constrained to the floor anymore. It's not locked in a position anymore. Now that screw home can kind of fly naturally. It's almost as if I told people to do a knee extension exercise, but turn their, like literally, when you do knee extension, instead of doing this, you just turn your knees out like that, and you try to extend you try to like push,
Good luck.
Yeah, it's like, it's not gonna happen, right? It's not gonna happen. It's not gonna happen it might happen, but it won't be a full range, right? So yeah. But back to what you were saying about the tibia.
Yeah, so I was just saying, like, going back to what you said, like, if you want your knee to bend properly, knee flexion is internal rotation, and it requires that distal femur to externally rotate, but that tibia to internally rotate. So if you're cueing a knees out and really just trying to drive your tibia, proximal tibia out as well, you're not really going to get that knee to bend until you torque it so hard. Going back to what he says, you torque it so hard, bounces back in. And you see this happen a lot, right? They bend their knees really out, it comes back in, they sink a little bit, and then just come back up to reduce force. And yeah, like you said, like, it's a strategy that is pure brute force. And, it's like, for me, it's a question of, if you're not a super competitive athlete, like, I think I would try to coach you out of it, unless it's a compensating strategy that you need to, come first place and, whatever. But like, for me, mainly, it's just like, we need to get things moving naturally. And it goes back to what you said, let the foot relax. Don't try to cue knees in or knees out. Most lifters don't need that. It's like, don't try to cue either the medial heel or the lateral heel. Just, the thing is, letting it relax and then see what changes need to be made through other interventions to drive changes in the squat subconsciously. Because I think when you try to drive conscious changes, that's when things get a bit messy, because your brain, when you're trying to lift some heavy weight and you're trying to think, okay, is my foot at this particular angle, and I've really got this, get my tailors, it's like, you're probably going to get yourself messed up over something else instead.
Yeah.
So I think when we're trying to drive changes, we would be trying to drive it through, perhaps some accessories, or through maybe a lighter variation day, through a different exercise. But I think when it comes to the squats, like if you're not able to sit up and down with constraints that are subconsciously cued into you, then that means we've got to peel back in some way or form, right? But I think the goal is always add constraints that you don't have to think about. For example, you like to give sometimes tempo squats, maybe box squats, stuff like that, right? We're trying to create constraints for you without you even have to think about it, to drive change.
Yeah, but I also think a lot of people don't need, speaking of constraints, a lot of people don't need like fancy stuff, right? They don't need
for sure.
They don't need a box squat. They don't need they don't need to, like, it's not a fancy exercise that needs to change. It's literally and this is the point that I wanted to kind of bring up about, is the biggest constraint you have when you're barbell squatting is basically two things: the floor and the barbell, right? So the like, you're not going to have to, you can't change much of the barbell, right? Like you can definitely address things, right? You can address your grip width on the bar, which will change the orientation of your skeleton. So one of the things that you see a lot of people do is they grip really close, right? They have this really close, tight in thing, and then they kind of hold it like that as well. And it's like, okay, like you need to think about why it's forming that shape, right? And I think this is the whole like age-old like powerlifting like adage, which is like, if something wants to be in a certain position, why don't you just put it there, right? So it's like, if your hips rise in a deadlift, start with your hips higher. It's like, if your elbows want to go out like that, maybe you just widen your grip, right? Like just leave it there. Don't try to like force a position. Like, okay, like this is with a caveat that I can understand certain people cannot do that, and it's usually lighter weight males and females, right? Simply because they don't have the muscle mass at the back of them to create that shelf. So therefore they're squeezing everything together to create that shelf. But the reason I don't particularly like that as it pertains to the constraint of the barbell is simply because every time you pull yourself in that close, you naturally will have some level of scapular retraction, right? And with scapular retraction comes ribcage protraction, right? So with ribcage protraction comes spinal extension, right? Like comes your, like comes spinal extension. And this is the thing that fucks a lot of people's squats up, right? Because with spinal extension and ribcage protraction, you have now a center of mass as proxied by the position of your sternum from a profile view of the from the side, right? You have now a sternum that is projected over your forefoot or even beyond that, right? So then you look down the chain, you're late as late can be. You're already like past toe off, right? Because your center of mass is now in front of your toes, right? So you're already later than late. There you're not gonna yield. There's no yielding that's gonna happen, right? You're just going to be overcoming, which might be a solution for to move very little, but also move a lot of weight, right? You create no space to move into. And then these people will say, oh, I've got to buy heels, right? And they pick the biggest heel, the tallest one.
Oh, so you can go even further.
Yeah, so it's like, okay, now I'm gonna just have more things push me even further forward, right? And it's like, why do and then the next excuse is oh, I'm not built to squat, right? Like it's like you probably just need to learn how to retract the rib cage, right? And we go back to the constraint of the barbell, right? Maybe you just widen your grip out, right? So that your scabs won't be so retracted, right? They have a little bit freedom to move, right? Then you can expand the back a little, move the rib cage back, and almost create this kind of turtle shell effect, right? And have that bar sit on your back still pretty naturally. And then you will find that change alone, just organizing around the constraint of the barbell, is so much easier. It's the same reason why people say, oh, it's so much easier to safety squat bar, or so much easier to goblet squat. It's like, yeah, because you have your hands here. You are not retracting your shoulder blades when you are safety bar squatting, right? You have a counterbalance, you have things in front. And it's like, does anyone ever wonder why people can belt squat like, like super maximal weights from their back squat? It's because there isn't a constraint on the back that is essentially pushing the rib cage forward, right? It's not that. So that is the first constraint, right? It's the barbell, right? How you organize that upper back, how you organize that shelving, how you organize that position to actually create a retracted rib cage, right? And it's not like, you don't want to be like goblet squatting your back squat, because that's not entirely a solution as well. Like, you do need some level of extension, but at the same logic, you shouldn't be squeezing yourself so much that your center of mass is literally past your toes, right? Yeah. So do you want to add anything onto that? Because before I move down to the ground.
Yeah. So I think you talked about one thing which I think is super important, is like heels, because a lot of people, wear heels and think that's going to automatically help them hit depth. But the type of heel you choose is super important, because when, like you said, if you've got a super high heel, that's actually going to pitch your center of weight forward rather than give you heel reference, right? So I think there's a brilliant analogy. It's like, if you stand on the foam roller, or if someone's wearing high heels, their center of mass is over their toes, right? So it's the profile of the heel height is super important as well. And if we're talking about whether we should be using heels or not, personally, I think, heels in itself will make you a more expansive individual, just because, well, you're getting more heel reference. So if you're able to hit depth in the powerlifting squat without a heel, you should 100%, in my opinion, wear flats, because you're going to be able to get more force production. If you're somebody who can't get to depth without assistance with heels, or you can't get to that comfortably, or you're not confident of doing it comfortably, then yeah, you should wear heels, because the goal is obviously for you not to bomb out the meet, right? Yeah. You've got to hit depth first before you be concerned about how much weight you can lift.
Yeah.
But if you're able to hit depth, okay, without heels, then don't wear heels, because heels don't actually make you into a better lifter. And like I said, choosing profile of the heels is super important. I think the legacy lifters have an insane heel height, which is like 0.9 inches or whatever.
But also the legacy lifters were never built for powerlifters.
Yeah, exactly.
That is not their target market. That is furthest away from. They're built for weightlifters, right?
Yeah.
Who need that upright squat, right? They were never built for powerlifters. None of you know what is built for the powerlifters? The shoe that is called a power lift, right?
I think I have that.
Yeah, it's like like maybe these companies building these shoes, like Adidas and Nike and Reebok, probably don't have a big stake in powerlifting, but maybe give them the benefit of the doubt that they know, or they work with a certain level of lifters that have given them the feedback of what they need, right? It's not just like picking up the highest heel that you can find, because you're not built to squat, right? It's like I have a lot of lifters that I call spider demons, that are not built to squat, but it's like they hit depth absolutely perfectly fine, right? You have loads of things you can manipulate before you even think about heel height. I think that is heel height is a crutch, and it for a lot of people, they don't understand center of mass before they look to the heel, right? And you want to finish what you were saying?
Yeah, no, I think another consideration, which may lead to a bit of memes about, but it is actually the toe box. toe box of the shoe, because if you're getting a shoe with a toe box where your toes are, like crunched together like this, well, if we need the foot to go fully flat and fully flatten out, but the shoe is constantly curling your toes inwards, then you're not going to be having a good time in the squat, because, well, you're probably going to get more of a proprioception of that forefoot more than you like to, just because of how it's crunching in. So I think there are a lot of shoes that are quite narrow toe box, and I usually, if I have a lifter telling me, oh, they can feel their toes a lot just standing still without even any pressure with a barbell, I'm like, okay, this is probably not going to work out when you have like 150, 160 kilos in your back.
Yeah.
So that's a super important consideration. Doesn't matter whether it's a squat, doesn't matter whether it's a deadlift. It just matters, and it's just common sense. It's like, if something doesn't fit, just don't wear it. But I think a lot of these shoes that are designed aren't necessarily the best ergonomically designed shoes. So like, I think the Malios have quite narrow toe box, and that's a super important consideration, because it could be the right heel height, or it could be the right profile, it could be the right flat, it could be whatever. But if you can't get comfortable in the toes, it's probably not going to be good force production.
The way I think about it is like, if I told you to do a push-up, but just keep your just bind your fingers, right? Bind your fingers and press your thumb down. Keep this like arch in your hand and just do push-ups. I can guarantee you are not going to do many push-ups. You're not going to do them. You're not going to feel strong. And like, the hand is the foot, right? These things, like, we evolved, in case people don't realize, like, we evolved. These used to be on our feet.
We used to be crawling.
Right. So we kind of evolved from that, and structurally, and like that's how nature organizes. It just repeats patterns, right? Just the iliums are a scap, and the sternum is like, a sphenoid, so on and so forth. Or it's just repeating patterns. So if you can see one strategy at the top, why does the strategy change down below if they are the similar structures? So that is one of the things, right? So definitely a consideration in terms of the feet and the toe box for sure.
You can continue your point about the second constraint.
So the second constraint is actually the floor, right? So again, we're gonna go back to the feet, right? And I don't really want to make this about the feet, but I just think from a practical standpoint, the number of things you can reduce looking at, the better your outcomes are going to be, because there will be a lot of noise in the system, right? You just need to pick pick which constraint you're going to manipulate, right? So if you only got two constraints, right? Barbell, which affects your center of mass, right? That's constraint number one. Number two is the floor, right? So you're not going to be able to change the floor, right? Like, I'm sorry, like, you don't get to squat on both balls, you're not going to be able to change.
I think I do that in my gym.
Oh yeah, your gym.
That's a great gym. It's a great gym. Everybody come visit our gym.
So if you can't change the floor, you have to change your relationship with the floor, right? So you can do this in two big ways. Number one is you can change the toe angle. Number two is you can change your stance width, right? and understand that when you change these two things, right, they change up the chain as well, right? So if we go back to the foot, one of the things that people don't realize, so let's talk about maybe let's talk about toe angle first, and then we'll talk about stance width. Okay, so toe angle, one of the things that I I've started coach people out of is having a V stance, right? And the reason I don't like a V stance is because a V stance naturally puts you in your feet into supination, right? And it ERs up the chain, right? So why I don't like the V stance is because if you look at the calcaneus's relationship with the rest of the foot, it is going to start the calcaneus extremely is it inverted? Yeah. So it's going to invert the calcaneus. So the calcaneus is going to point.
I'm not very good at presenting, but yeah.
So for people who don't know, maybe I just find a
there's a better video on.
Yeah, so like, so people are like, oh, so yeah, so basically this is what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. I think this is a better one, but if this comes up, it might be easier to see. So there we go. So when you wait a second. No, is it everted or inverted? I think it's inverted. This is a bad picture.
We're talking about pronation or supination.
We're talking about supination, right? So there we go. So when you start in a V stance, right, that calcaneus is kind of going to be pointing out like this, supinated, right? Because you're literally gonna do this, so it's gonna point in like this, right? So now up the chain, what's happened is you have loads and loads of external rotation, right? Loads and loads of external rotation, loads and loads of space, loads and loads of ability to move it, loads and loads of space to move into, right? But what you don't have is the ability to produce force once you're yielded, right? So at the end of the day, no one cares how deep you can squat. People, you need to squat deep enough, and you need to stand the fuck back up, right? That's it, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to talk about so what people do when they're like, oh, I'm squatting too deep, is or they're like, oh, you know, I'm not squatting deep enough, is they point the toes out. It's like, okay, you solved the problem now, but you've given yourself so much range control that you're not actually powerful in the weakest range of a squat, right? Which is the most challenging range of a squat for any human being, is literally coming out of the hole, right? So people are like, oh, I don't feel, now I can hit that, but I feel so much weaker. And it's like, okay, let's put a heel on it, right? So this is how not only are you pushing yourself forward, you are continuing to supinate a feet, right, that is already supinated because of your stance width and your toe angle, right? Because now you're going to be standing, so you're going to be standing in this kind of V stance, right? This is like, look at it. It's gonna. So this is obviously this is valgus. Try to find a good picture for it. Yeah, but basically you're standing like this. So you got a lot of you got a foot that's in plantar flexion, adduction, and the calcaneus is inverted, right? So then people complain about, oh, I'm just so weak, but it's like, I can't hit that, I'm so weak, blah blah blah. But it's because it's like, first of all, the constraint of the chain doesn't allow you to squat deep if your center of mass is forward, right? And then second of all, you don't really have you're now back at the problem of you're not actually powerful, right? Because you've got all this range that happens, right? And then when you squat, because you get told a root, you don't allow that like that IR of the the femur and the tibia on the femur, right? And then what picks up the question now is, what is IRing? What is producing force, right? And usually it's people's quads, right? Because they like we had the chat with Alex. It's like now the quad becomes reorientated to become absolutely straight from its oblique angle, and it just tries to put force into the floor, right? You get a pelvis as well that's dumping forward, puts force into the floor. When the pelvis dumps forward, you get a spine that picks up lumbar lordosis, and then hyperextends, right? And then just pushes down. So it's like people are like, okay, I don't know why I'm just not built to squat. It's like, well, where do we even start, right? If you fix up the chain, you get your grip right, you get your bracing right, you get center of mass right, and you're still bad, then you need to look at the foot, right? What is happening at the foot? Are you taking a toe angle that just doesn't allow you to produce force, right? Because holding supination gives you space, doesn't allow you to produce force, right? Because there's nothing to push into. Your feet are absorbing the force, your knees are absorbing the force, and your spine is absorbing the force, right? So that is on the toe out kind of position. And this is the same. This is the thing that we talked about on the deadlift as well, right? If you have too much toe out, you don't allow that relative internal rotation to happen. There's no force that can be produced, right? I remember we looked at Tian's deadlift, we looked at Lee's deadlift, we look at Pug's deadlift, right? All of those things, everyone, regardless of the stance they take, they present it with relative amounts of internal rotation as they move the bar. So it's not different. It's not much different from when you're squatting. You need that internal rotation to happen somewhere. And usually how it looks is that knee coming in and that spine hyperextending. So those are, because the spine hyperextending is the pelvis dumping forward. So anterior tilt is an internal rotation strategy. Knee valgus, I don't call it valgus because it's not a real valgus, it's just the knees coming in.
Yeah.
It's just following the pelvis to do what it needs to do to put force into the floor, right? So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, like you said, when people have knee pain, they're questioning, why does the knee pick up a lot of traction? That could be a multitude of reasons, but the most common thing is, like you said, if somebody's unable to manage their center of mass, something has to decelerate them. Otherwise, you're going to fall to the ground, right? You have, like, unless you constantly fall to the ground every rep, which means you failed anyway, you're in big trouble. But so something's going to stop you, right? So if it's not the back, then it's probably the knees, and that's why when you probably have lifters, and I myself was like, oh, why does my quad feel a bit sore today? Or it's like, why do I have these tendonitis symptoms? It's like, well, you can't decelerate yourself through your foot, smushing, not smushing, but pronating into the ground to decelerate. Something's got to stop. So it's going to be that knee to stop you from falling forward, and it's going to absorb a lot of the pressure, right? And that's exactly why, we don't have a crystal ball. It's not always, causal, but there's usually a high correlation with people who can't manage a center mass and dump themselves into anterior rotation, and whether it be VMO or VL pain, right? And going back to what you said, is like the vastus lateralis, the outer side of the quad, which is an extender, right? And it gets over leveraged. Why people have a lot of hip pinching, and also VL extreme tightness, or even pain at that VL insertion area, is like, well, when you're in that anterior orientation, the TFL's fibers, right, they get reorientated and they act as compensating internal rotators, right? So, I myself went through that period of, the hip being, the hip or the TFL being in pain. Is like, well, if I'm not able to decelerate myself, and to avoid an overly hingy squat, right, then we're going to be using the TFL and the VM or the VL to pick up the slack. And all of this, once again, like you said, goes back to managing the center of gravity and trying to get them to produce the most amount of force through the proper mechanisms. But I think this leads to a very interesting point, is like, we know that the barbell back squat or the low bar squat is probably one of the more compressive exercises, and we talk about practical implications of coaching through it. So if we have a lifter or who is unable to enter into these positions comfortably, how would we try to coach them or manage through it? We talked about last time, you had a lifter who just brute forces through everything. But I think the deadlift is a lot easier lift to brute force through, because it goes back to the lack of an eccentric.
Yeah.
Right. The deadlift, if you're, I have a lifter too, right? It's like a lifter Shabab is like, you just completely rip through it with your lower back and just, completely come up in the concentric. But if you can't yield very well, you don't have, the right management of an eccentric, forget doing concentric, right? And I think this is why the squat is much more punishing as a lift. And this is why you said, like, a lot of people say, I'm not built to squat. I'm not built to do this. Well, it's just because, like, you're probably not doing too well on the deadlift when you say you're not too built to squat, because you just, the squat is just going to punish you more with these two lifts, with the eccentric portion and the concentric portion. So let's talk a bit about now practical application of, okay, we have a lifter who may not be able to enter into low bar squat, whether it be lack of rib cage retraction, or whether it be, the hip flexion is poor, or the body weight squat might be 20 degrees. Like, how would we go through this?
So I think how I would go through it is, so we talk about kind of the constraint of the barbell. Practical application standpoint, I would change, if you've managed up the chain, right? If you've managed up the chain, you've gotten their center of gravity back. The next thing I would manage is that toe angle, right? The point I want to make about it is we need to understand, in order to understand how to produce force, how to have space and produce force, we need to understand the excursion of the pelvis that as it goes through the movement, right? So you have your pelvis model, right? So at the top it is, you have a pelvis that's counter nutated like that, right? So when you hit about 90, what happens? It nutates, right? And then if you got a squatty squat and you can go past that, you will go, you would re-counter nutate. So you go counter nutation, nutation, counter nutation.
Yep.
Powerlifting squat, we don't go into a position of, we don't re-counter nutate, right? Okay, so we understand that, right? So the next thing we want to understand is, how do we constrain the pelvis to stay in a nutated position and not counter nutate, right? So if you stand in the V stance and you squeeze your glutes, so if you take the pelvis out, you stand in the V stance, right, and you squeeze your glutes, you will stay counter nutated, right?
Yeah.
When you hit 90, you don't have a structural advantage of a pelvis in a nutated position, right? You don't have a closed off pelvis to stop downward force.
Yeah.
Right. So what's going to happen is you are going to, you're just going to continue to plummet to the ground.
Yeah.
Right. Then you have all the range in the world, but you have a pelvic floor that's just going to go. And it's going to be so eccentric that it cannot produce force. Okay.
Yeah.
Practical explanation. Change that V stance, right? Change it to a toe forward. Now, next problem is people are going to complain if they don't change another thing. People are going to complain they don't have space to squat into, right? So when you change this to this, right, and you don't change anything else, right, and you have a barbell on your back, people are going to not be able to hit depth, right? So where are you going to find your compensatory depth whilst maintaining all of your IRs, all of your counter nutation? Is you're going to have to shift the stance out, right? So when you shift the stance out, you turn the tibias into internal rotation, right?
Yeah.
And when you turn those tibias into internal rotation, you also close off the pelvis, right? So if you have lifters that are very, 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 like literally, this is why the sumo deadlift is brilliant, right? Because you take the furthest away stance that you can, closes off the back of the pelvis. You don't move back. In a sumo deadlift, you don't move back. You don't move very far back. You literally close off the pelvis, right? So now you can't move back anymore because you've taken this stance. You don't squat very deep as well. You don't move through a very long range as well, right? So how can we take what we know about the sumo deadlift and apply it to a barbell back squat, right? Because look, we're not here to create this wide squatty squat excursion, heel elevated goblet squat kind of thing. We're here to just get our depth and stand back up, right? So what I do from a practical standpoint is I turn the feet straight and I move the stance out, because that will give the lifter that space to drop into, right? Especially if they're not built to squat, simply because they right? They can now approximate their sternum back a little bit more because I've effectively shortened their legs, right? So in that sense, now they have this A-frame, right, which is also great. Like the A-frame is great for lateral stability as well, right? So a lot of lifters will kind of complain that they have hip shifts, and they will have and you have a lot of lifters who will also complain that, they can't, you see them do this, right, with the bar on their back, right? Simply because the barbell is now like, the barbell is actually like 7 foot long with weight at the end, right? So if you think about it from a physics perspective, you now have like, you almost have kind of this structure, right?
Yeah.
And now not only do you have to go up and down like that, you also have to stabilize. You also have to
side to side,
like laterally, right? So the other thing for me is, why don't we just form a square? Let's make a square. Let's make the lifter look like a square, right? And for me, from a practical standpoint, what I will do is try to match up their stance with their elbow width. So if they take a grip like that, right, you would have, if you draw a square around them, they would form that kind of square shape, right? So that they're pretty stable laterally, but they still have enough rotation through the hip just to get depth, right? And nothing more, right? So this is why I'm like, I don't try to coach people to squat deeper than necessary. If you get white lights in competition, that's what I care about, because depth doesn't win you meets, weight on the bar does, right? So that is my like kind of practical consideration, right? And also when you widen out that stance, you form that A-frame, it also causes that pelvis to have to open up like that and close the back, right? So that you therefore can just like squat, hit the end range, literally hit the end range of your hip flexion, stand back up, right? Your pelvis has literally created a constraint for you to be unable to squat any deeper than possible. And for me, the only downside to this is if you don't manage it through accessory selection and you don't give them back some level of relative motion, like if you're doing your split squats, your closed stance work, they will cop a little bit of discomfort through things like their TFLs, their glute medius, their hamstrings. They will cop a little bit of that, but they're gonna cop it anyways, right? If they squat any other way, they're still gonna cop it somewhere. It's just understanding like, okay, we're gonna cop some level of discomfort in powerlifting, right? Shoulders, hips, whatever. But it's like, at least make it worth. At least make sure the weight on the bar is worth getting like slightly uncomfortable for, right? And you see that with like heavies, right? Super heavies, right? They keep widening out their stances because they need to find the space. So yeah, that is my kind of practical solution. I would go after the setup. The first thing at the first constraint at the top, shoulders, barbell, rib cage, and then secondly, stance width and toe angle. So I actually have an example that I can bring up, but do you have anything you want to kind of add to that?
Yeah, no, I think one of the more interesting, actually, before we talk about anything else, it's when we talk about the counter nutation again. When we recounter nutate, right? Counter nutation is flexion, and that's when we theoretically see a bit of flexion in the lower back to absorb because we're hitting so far deep. Because in a powerlifting squat, we're not recounter nutating, and people are thinking, is butt wing good, butt wing back? Well, it's not a simple answer, but when people do flex excessively, that's probably not recounter nutation, right? That's probably a lifter who's run out of range too far early. Okay, so I think that's a very important distinction to make, because theoretically, if I was doing an ass to grass ATG squat, I would have some flexion at 120 degrees of hip flexion in the back. But when we're getting hip flexion in the back super early at maybe 70, 80 degrees or 90 degrees of the squat, that's not recounter nutation. That's probably just you running out of range and not managing your center mass so well, right? So that's a super important distinction to make when people ask, is it normal? And then I think another thing we talk about as well is when we're getting people to enter into just the right amount of depth is getting that hinge right for the low bar squat, right? We know that the low bar squat, we're not like trying to be, we're not trying to enter acid rest. So we're trying to treat it almost like a compressive, super compressive squat where we're just trying to get just the right amount of external expansion, right, to yield and then just explode back up, right? So the reason why, especially when we see tall lifters hinge, it goes back to what you said. It's like, if you notice yourself dipping forward as you're going down because you're just standing too far upright, it's like, why don't we just start in the position where you can just go down in a straight line? It's like the same thing in the deadlift, right? It's like, why bother like letting your hips rise up and taking all that force where your back has to like load up a bit more? It's like, why bother like feeling an inconsistent bar pass? Like, it goes back to what we said. It's like, we need to manage the center of gravity right, and getting that hinge is going to help you open up some space as well. So you don't feel like you're just dipping forward onto your toes even more. You just keep it relatively like, mid-foot to heel.
A super simple heuristic when you want to talk about managing gravity is what goes forward and what needs to go forward and what needs to go back, right? Mm-hmm. So if you've ever seen someone do a bodyweight squat but throw their hands forward, that's a compensation. That's compensation all day, every day, because their hands, right, them throwing their hands forward, right, is an act to put mass forward, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at a squat, any and almost every fault that you can come up with a squat, chest fall, hip rise, stripper squat, butt wink, it's all a strategy to just throw things back or forward, right? Yeah. Like if you have a spinal flexion, if your spine flexes in a barbell back squat, you don't have enough weight back. Your spine is literally pushing, like your body is pushing viscera backwards so you don't fall forwards, right? Yeah. So you have this, like, you have your spine moving from a lordosis to a kind of like a flexion, simply because everything in your guts is just going backwards, right? If you see, the most common one, high level lifters, look at someone like Clinton, for example, the elbows come out, right, at the sticking point. It's because he's pushing himself so far forward, right? If he's trying to keep the elbows down, right, he's gonna fall forward, right? So that elbow rising up, weight shift, everything. You see people with big heads throw their head back, compensation, throwing weight back, because they need to externally rotate, right? You see people dipping there when they start the lift, right? They, like some people, they set up with a bar in their back. They look on the floor all the time, right? It's why, because they can't get enough mass. Now, if they try to stand too upright, they look down. They can't get enough mass forward, right? It's all a strategy of managing center of mass, right? Like people are like, oh, don't try to coach them out of it. It's like, yes, don't try to coach them out of it, but understand that it's your body's way of like self-organization, right? Because at the end of the day, your body doesn't really care about a barbell on your back. Your body cares about you staying upright to breathe and survive, right? So everything needs to be, I think this is where like we talked to a lot of people, like, it becomes a meme of like, does this expansion compression model matter? It's like, it doesn't matter until it does, and maybe it doesn't matter, but it's a very, 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 very useful lens to see, like, from a principles point of view, like, can you explain with a principle why that is happening, right? Yeah. Why are the elbows flaring? Why are you doing certain thing? Why are you throwing your head up, right? Why are you, why are your hips rising, right? It's all strategies to keep that barbell in the most efficient path, right? And how you decide what is most efficient is unfortunately proxied by the weight on the bar, right? Yeah. And if you see, and so if people are like, okay, sometimes, so it's like people say, you can't say that injury happens. Okay, like, let's leave the injury discussion off of the board, right? Let's talk about efficiency, right? You're not going to be very efficient every time you have a center of mass organization problem where you kick the hips back, or you have that chest fall. It's inefficient, but like, what is the solution? The solution is not doing pin squats. because you can still pin squat and the bar can still come forward, right? Like people are like, oh, just do more pin squats or do, it's like, and then people will ask me, what do I think I should do? It's like, do pause squats and tempo squats.
Yeah.
And it's like, are you sure? It's like, I'm like, yeah, I'm sure. Like, you just need to get better at squatting, right? And you need to change your squatting technique. You don't need to change it. You don't need to put a pin squat in. You don't need to put like some special like exercise in, special variation in, because you have, especially if it does not address the center of mass problem, right? If especially doesn't address the balance problem, right? If you're still coming down, no amount of pin squat is going to change that, right? If you're still not organizing the bar correctly on your back, no, your center of mass is still going to be pushed forward every single time, regardless of the environment, right? Because the internal environment to produce force is not correct, right? Yeah. So constrain the internal environment around the external environment, and there's only two things you need to constrain around: barbell, floor. That's the only two things, right? Everything else from that, you can pin squat, you can reverse band, you can do all of that stuff, and there is a place for that, right? You know, like unloading the pelvic floor, blah blah blah, blah, which I don't think we will get into, but like start at those two things, right? Look at the foot, look at the stance, look at the position of the bar on the back, right? And that's already plenty for most people, right? Before they even talk about box squats or pin squats or those kind of things.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, it's like as coaches, I don't really care what model I use as long as it helps get our clients, from point A to point B in the fastest and most efficient and obviously safest point of time. Like expansion compression model has been catching a lot of flack recently. And I'm like, doesn't really matter what the model is. Like, I just need as many tools in the toolbox, and I choose the most efficient one, right, to make me a more well-rounded person to not diagnose, but to troubleshoot when things aren't going so well. I don't really care. Like maybe in 2022 it might be something else, right? But I think our goal is to continuously learn and embrace different ideas, and then see where can we pinpoint or where can we pick certain principles and try to help a lifter in situation A, B, or C, or D, right? And I think that's I think a good learning lesson when people ask like, oh yeah, let's like this model doesn't matter. Like, yeah, it doesn't really matter unless the issue requires such a thing, right? But yeah, I think
like it's like saying I don't need to know people. I think the metaphor people is I don't need to know how a car runs to know how to drive, right?
Yeah.
Like I take it to the workshop, something's broken. It's like okay, well your squat is not exactly very efficient. Maybe take it to a coach, and then people are like, oh, but like coaches overcomplicate stuff. It's like yeah, because the human body is complex. Like who would have thought, right? It's not like it's not just like as long as your knees bend, your quads are working. It's like, in fact, if like your knees bend a certain way, right, your quads might actually not be working, right? Or like it's like saying, oh, as long as the wheels on the car move, the car is working. It's like, yeah, like if I put a big hole in the bottom of your car and like go full Flintstones with you, yeah, the wheels are working, but I'm pretty sure your car isn't working. Like you're just using the legs, right? Like Flintstones mode doesn't, like, just because the car moves doesn't mean like the car works, right? Like I mean, like it's a pretty like stupid analogy, but that is a point that just goes to show like how stupid people think that, oh, just because my knees are bending, my hips are flexing, my glutes will work, my muscles will work. It's like, no, people squat for years and they never develop glutes, they never develop hamstrings, they never develop quads. It's like, yeah, maybe those things are really not working, right? Like, and then they have like erectors the size of like, like
I love it, man. You love it when you see like adamantium erectors. You're like, oh, nice. Yeah.
Like I'm like, good. Now let's get your legs in the mix, and you'll be crazy, right? And it's like, sometimes it's just as easy as that. Yeah.
And it's like, I understand it's like, yeah, our job is to make things simple for clients, but it's like like you said, it's like if everything was so simple, I don't think we'd have a job, right? Like, like these theories or these models exist because, like you said, it's complex. Like, and it's our job to digest, break it down very simply, and give simple solutions. But it doesn't mean what we're studying is simple, right? Like, like we could go through my own, fucking white adductor, and it would talk for 3 hours, like, why it's fucked. It's not simple, right? And I think that's I think a lot of people sometimes think because I think that maybe a bit of complacency as well, where people are like, well, you don't need to go that complex because, like you said, who cares about whether one foot's in front of the other? Well, one foot in front of the other might be someone's left side is more extended than the right side, right? Someone's might got right weak orientation where maybe it matters or maybe it doesn't matter, right? But I think these tiny details do add up, right? It's like, okay, and I think you probably have a lifter or two, and I have a lifter or two. We can show like where sometimes these things do matter, right? Like, and then we have to go more complex. But most lifters, they're okay and they're not too banged up, then okay, we can keep it very simple. But sometimes we do have to go more complex.
And the thing is like, I mean, this is kind of like aside from this conversation, it's like, I mean, this is a big tangent about, just a little bit of rant, but it's like, we like you and I, when we've worked on your kind of adductor issue, right? We our conceptual understanding was like on, right? It's checked out by like everyone, like we have the right thinking about it, right? But it's like until we kind of like spoke to Alex about it, right? With the oblique shift and the kind of like the twist of the femur, right? Unless you have an eye for that, no one's gonna. It's so impossible to tell, right? And it's like sometimes people do need that level of complexity, but then the application is where it matters, right? Like we for a long time dealing with your situation haven't been able to like really apply the theory like to help you lift without pain, right? And we're still kind of struggling with that, right? It's not perfect, right? But the thing is without that, right? Without that, it's like, okay, we can definitely fight through the pain, right? But also at the same point, it's like, what's the ceiling on that, right? The explanation is not so we can do less work. The explanation is so that we can raise the ceiling and get you where you want to go a little bit faster, right? Because otherwise you could just do it yourself and you wouldn't need to like pay us money to help you make progress. Like I think that's my rant on the matter. But
it's like these little things, like I said, like you said, they completely matters. Like these tiny things can get you that extra 2-3%.
Yeah.
Okay, what's 2-3%? It's not much. Okay, but it goes from you lifting 100 kilos to 102.5 kilos at competition, and then that could be first or second place.
It's not even that, right? It's not even that. It's 100. It's like, okay, you could do 100 kilos in this session. Next session you could do 102. Next session you could do 105. Next session you could do 107. Next session you could do 110. Right? It's like people, like you are a good like finance, like economics kind of person. You study economics, the effect of compounding, right? Like
exactly.
If I make a person, don't even talk about like 1% better, talk about 0.5% better, accrue that over like say if a lifter trains 4 times a week, accrue that over like 16 sessions, like bro, the compound on that is huge. Like if you train 4 times a week every week, that's 200 in sessions, right? Compound, but like 0.5 on that, that's massive. That's a massive improvement. Obviously it doesn't scale like that, but that is a point that I'm trying to get across,